The Nintendo 64 is often known for having sour developer relationships rather than building them. After all, we know what happened with Final Fantasy VII, and it wasn't until later in the console's life that Capcom decided to show up and start releasing titles. But what many people never seem to remember was a very important deal that Nintendo struck with LucasArts, which would give them 3 console exclusive Star Wars games with a 5-year exclusive window. What was also incredible about the Nintendo 64 era was that the Star Wars franchise was also coming back, with the Star Wars Episode 1 movie being in development, and it would bring the Star Wars universe to a whole new generation of people. It's fair to say that as a Star Wars fan, owning the Nintendo 64 was a great time to be a gamer, and so for today's video we're taking a look at the 4 Star Wars games which were released on the console. As always, if you're interested in a full review of any of these games, then check out the video description where I'll post links to them. Star Wars Shadows of the Empire was for many their first taste of Star Wars on the N64. Originally planned to be a launch title, it eventually arrived a little later than planned in December of 1996. Development of the game actually started in 1994, and due to the very early stage of development of the N64 hardware, it was still yet to be finalised. This meant that LucasArts built the entire game on the Silicon Graphics Onyx, and they didn't even have controller hardware to play the game on. Instead, they tested the game using a modified Super Nintendo controller which had been built by Konami. Nintendo was so strict with their non-disclosure agreements with developers that even when they had a pre-release controller to test the game on, it was placed in a cardboard box with 2 holes to put their hands in so it couldn't be visibly seen. Before the game was demoed at E3 in 1996, where it got mixed reviews, and that was one of the core reasons that LucasArts cancelled the game as a launch title and gave the development team a few more months to do their thing. The game was originally planned to have 19 levels, which was later cut down to 12, and then finally to 10 for the final build of the game. With the developers getting to grips with the hardware and new technologies like motion capture which were planned, many staff members were working 100-hour weeks for months on end on this game. So how did the game turn out? Well, this one's really tricky because I think a lot of it will come down to nostalgia. As this game sold fairly well on the launch, many people, myself included, will have fond memories of playing this game, and if you were going straight from a Super Nintendo to this game, then it would have been incredible. The mix of gameplay modes makes this game somewhat of a mixed bag, and many reviewers state that the first level, which is the Battle of Hoth, was the highlight and the rest of the game went downhill. I personally disagree with this, as I feel that throughout the game there are some great levels, however they are often sandwiched between some less than great experiences. The game has its frustrating moments. There are a fair few glitches, and I wasn't too keen on Dash Rendar as a main character. But the storyline is awesome, and the music and overall feel of the game fits in perfectly with the Star Wars universe, and offers enough charm on its own to really hold up against other Star Wars games that have been released, especially when you consider this was out on 1996 on a home console. With some cool bosses, gameplay variation to keep things fresh, and nostalgia goggles to overlook the flaws, this is a game which I think most people could happily play from start to finish. But for someone playing it for the first time in the modern day, then it may just prove to be a step too far, and so perhaps the version on good old games which runs on 64-bit Windows systems may be the better option, especially if you find the N64 controller tricky and would rather use a more modern controller setup. Star Wars Rogue Squadron for many is the best Star Wars game on the console, and some may argue it's also one of the best Star Wars games period. It was the first of the Star Wars trilogy of Rogue Squadron games, and it landed on Nintendo 64 in 1998 and was developed by Factor 5 and LucasArts. Development began pretty much right after Shadows of the Empire was released. Factor 5 were creating a game engine which would allow large terrain maps, and when LucasArts saw this, they knew it was the right game engine for their new project, where the focus would be on space combat. The decision was made after feedback from gamers and critics alike from Shadows of the Empire, where many people noted the most fun was in the spacecraft levels. Factor 5 wanted to make the entire game a recreation of famous scenes from the movies, but LucasArts rejected that, as they were reluctant to allow games to draw directly from the core movies. After a tech demo wowed audiences at E3 in 1998, Factor 5 appealed to Nintendo to allow them permission to implement the expansion pack into the game. Nintendo wanted the expansion pack to be used for hardware purposes, but after Acclaim had shown it to be used for improved visuals with their work on Turok 2, Nintendo gave them the green light. This means that if you have the expansion pack, you can run the entire game in a high-res mode. Now, as we all know, the expansion pack often leads to improved visuals but horrific frame rate issues. But Rogue Squadron did a fantastic job of retaining a playable speed whilst also having much more refined graphics with it installed. I've told the story many times before, but it was screenshots in magazines showing the differences that actually convinced me to buy the expansion pack at the same time as I picked this game up, despite my dad thinking it all looked like it was going to be a con. Within 10 minutes of showing him the differences in game, he was eating his words. And I still think that this is one of the best examples on the console of how to use the expansion pack properly. Perhaps that's another video on its own right to look at. The expansion pack wasn't the only technical achievement of the game. Factor 5 created the Moses FX sound system, which would use advanced compression techniques to allow much more sound in the game than was traditionally possible on a cart-based format. Rogue Squadron alone has over 80 minutes of high quality stereo sound. With the game being released, none other than Mark Hamill himself helped with some minor promotion by playing the game in children's hospitals with sick kids, but it was the critical acclaim that reviewers heaped on the title which helped it to become a must-own game. Selling over 1 million copies, even the game's producer said it had sold well above their expectations, and whether you play this on the N64 or the PC now, it's no doubt one of the most fun Star Wars games around. IGN stated that once you play the game in high resolution on the N64, it's hard to go back, and I can really agree with that. When you're selecting your craft before each level, I was blown away with the detail you could see in game, and the lighting effects when playing and huge amount going on at the same time was truly something breathtaking. Of course, now its visuals show their age somewhat, but the arcade-like gameplay experience, when combined with the challenging and yet rewarding medal system, makes this a must-play experience. The only real criticism that reviewers could throw at the game was the lack of multiplayer, and for me that wasn't the be-all and end-all, but it would have been a nice feature to have had. You can't talk about Rogue Squadron without talking about the unlockables, because this was a stroke of genius. Sure, you have fan service levels like Beggar's Canyon and the Death Star Trench Run, but of course you can then go on to unlock things like the Millennium Falcon to make you feel like a kid again, just dreaming of piloting it. But let's talk about timing, because Rogue Squadron was released 6 months before Star Wars Episode 1 hit movie theatres. To capitalise on this, Factor 5 were given design documents for the Naboo starfighter craft which they'd built into the game. They used advanced coding techniques to hide this from gamers, reviewers, cheat devices. Heck, even many of the staff who were working on the game weren't aware that the Naboo starfighter was actually in the game. So when the movie was released into theatres, they finally released a cheat code which you can enter to be able to play the Naboo starfighter. In this day and age, being able to keep that a secret for 6 months after a game's release would be near impossible. But it's just one of the many fun memories I have of the game, and it meant that I couldn't wait to go back and play through the entire game again with the Naboo starfighter one more time, long after I'd completed the levels and the game itself. Simply put, if you own an N64 console, I really think that you should have Rogue Squadron in your collection. Star Wars Episode 1 Racer was developed by LucasArts, and it landed on Nintendo 64 in mid-1999. Whilst I'll leave you to comment your own feelings on the movie, there's few that could argue that the best scene was not the epic pod race, but thankfully that's the inspiration for this game. Development of this one also began just after Shadows of the Empire was released, and the studio had very little source material to work with. At one stage, they even had to work out the physics engine for the game from less than 30 seconds of footage showing the actual pod race the game would be based on. However, this lack of knowledge also helped the game in a way. They were not restricted to using Tatooine as a base, and so they were able to create their own race levels to throw in some originality and also creativity into the mix, and this greatly helps the overall feel of the game with some truly cool track design. Thankfully though, they were given all of the characters' details who would be pod racers, and so the game contains the same ones found in the movie, including Sebulba, who is my personal favourite. The N64 version also features 4-player split-screen multiplayer, but given the speed of the game, I would personally recommend no more than 2 players at the same time. As a single-player experience, the game contains a lot of depth. You have all of the courses and tournaments to win, but it was the ability to level up your pod racer which always appealed to me. What was even cooler was that you can buy new, expensive parts with your prize money, but you could also take a punt at the scrapyard and buy a used part. It was always something a compromise between a risk and a reward, as buying used parts meant they were subject to failing and possibly losing the money that you'd spent on it. There were also a number of other areas to upgrade, including your boosters, and so by the end of the game, once you had maxed out your pod racer, you could have something truly special to pilot. A lot of people talk about the fastest racing games on the console, and again that's perhaps best looked at in a separate video of its own, but Episode 1 Racer is a damn fast racing game. Again, with the expansion pack installed, things look even sharper, and the music from the movie is also intertwined with custom made pieces of music for the game. Overall, it felt like a fresh new Star Wars experience for a modern player, and in a way, it lacked a little bit of that nostalgic Star Wars feel that many of us grew up with at the time. But still, when you look at the game without those rosy tints, it's a fine example of how to do a frighteningly quick racing game on the N64. It's fast, intense, and at times hard to handle, and it can be frustrating to the point of rage quitting. And then with a few simple tweaks to your craft, it can become a joy to play again. This is one which I think a lot of people will have already played, but for anyone new to the game, I can't recommend the Nintendo 64 version. Instead, if you want to play on a console, the Dreamcast version is the way to go, but I'd even recommend bypassing consoles altogether and playing the new HD remaster version, which allows full HD resolutions as well as 60 frames per second, and that's hard to argue as now being the best way to play this game. Star Wars Battle for Naboo is perhaps the least remembered Star Wars game on the Nintendo 64, and one which I think is overlooked far too often. It is a follow-up to Rogue Squadron, although it doesn't form part of the Rogue Squadron trilogy, which would only be continued on the GameCube. Developed by Factor 5 and LucasArts, it landed on store shelves in late 99 or early 2000 depending on where on the world you live, and despite at first glance looking like it used the Rogue Squadron engine, it was in fact an entirely new one built exclusively for this game. The game takes place during Star Wars Episode 1, and you take control of Gavin Sykes, who is a lieutenant in the Naboo Royal Security Force. With 15 levels and many of them drawing directly from the movie, being combined with some impressive visuals and great music, you may be surprised by the somewhat mixed reviews the game got. This pretty much came down to one thing only: if the reviewer actually liked the movie. You see, whilst the gameplay was pretty much universally praised, the visuals commended, and the overall package being one of the better games on the console, reviewers were split on the story in the game. It seemed that if they loved the movie, then the game also got a glowing review. If the reviewer felt the movie had been a letdown, then they marked the game down for its storyline and uninteresting missions. In a way, although I would disagree with reviewing a game on that basis, I do think that your enjoyment of the game will come down to how interested you were or are in the movie. As I wasn't a huge fan of Star Wars Episode 1, I found that Rogue Squadron was more my cup of tea. But equally, I know many people that love Star Wars Episode 1 and couldn't wait to get their hands on this game. One thing I did however love about this game was that you're now not only in the air, but you also take on missions on land and on sea. So the craft that you'll pilot and control are more varied than Rogue Squadron, but you'll lose that nostalgic feel as you're unlikely to have the same attachment to a police cruiser in Battle for Naboo as you are with an A-Wing in Star Wars Rogue Squadron. On a technical level, the game is much more playable due to the greatly improved draw distance that the new engine allowed. This wasn't possible on the old engine, and they also implemented the particle system which they had built for Indiana Jones on the N64 into Battle for Naboo, which further enhanced the visuals. This allowed up to 3,000 particles to be displayed without dropping the frame rate, which means that the explosions had a much more satisfying visual aesthetic than Rogue Squadron. Interestingly, the PC port of the game was terribly done. So much so in fact that the PC version received dramatically lower scores than the N64 version, and this is one instance where if you like what you see and have heard, then the Nintendo 64 cart is really the one to pick up and play. Star Wars Battle for Naboo also contains a whole ton of unlockables and secrets. Like Rogue Squadron, it retained the medal award system after each level, which gives a great deal of replayability, and the development team also included around 5 minutes of commentary for each level as a bonus, and so it's one of the earliest instances of this happening in a video game. So there you have it, the 4 Nintendo 64 Star Wars games on the console, and what I love most about this is that the 4 games all feel genuinely different. When you often play games from the same series, they retain the same core gameplay type, but with Star Wars on the N64, I really feel that there's something for everyone. And so for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know what you think the best Star Wars game on the console is, and any memories you have of playing these games when you were younger. I'd also love to know if you're new to N64 Star Wars games, and which game on this rundown list has whet your appetite for some Star Wars action. As always, sound off in the comments section down below, and until next time.